Indians love to flex that their massive market makes them invincible. 1.4 billion people. Who dare mess with that kind of muscle? Well, I'm here to rain on that parade. China doesn't care as much as you think. All that swagger about India's population being some unbeatable trump card, it's about to get smashed with cold, hard facts. Indians might think they're the center of the universe, but for China, they're just a tiny speck in a much bigger game. Stick around because we're tearing this myth apart piece by piece, and trust me, it's not going to be pretty. I'm Harrison Blackwell, and you're watching Info Safari. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button already. What are you even doing with your life? We're about to unpack why India's so-called massive market isn't the superpower flex Indians think it is. I've got the stats, the sarcasm, and the reality check you didn't know you needed. Let's get into it. First off, let's talk trade volume. Because if you think India's market keeps China awake at night, you're dreaming. In 2024, China's total trade, exports plus imports, hit a ridiculous $6 trillion, according to early numbers from their General Administration of Customs. That's the kind of cash flow that makes your head spin. Now, how much of that pie does India get? In fiscal year 24, April 2023 to March 2024, India-China trade was $118.4 billion. Do the math, that's less than 2% of China's global trade, 2 measly percent. Meanwhile, China's top trading partner ASEAN clocked $911 billion in 2023. The EU and US are each pulling over $500 billion a year, $573 billion and $502 billion respectively, based on 2023 figures. Even Japan and South Korea are in the $200 billion plus club, with $238 billion and $211 billion. India's $118 billion? It's basically the loose change China finds under the couch. They're out there playing in the big leagues, ASEAN, the EU, the US, while India's waving its arms like, "Hey, look at me!" Sorry, but for China, India's market is a blip, not even a top 5 priority. Next up, India's rank as an importer. Indians love to brag. We're one of the biggest importer in the world. Sure, $723 billion in imports for 2022 per the CIA World Factbook sounds like a flex, until you see how little it impresses China. In 2023, China's exports to India were $117.68 billion per UN Comtrade. That's just 3.5% of China's total exports, which hit $3.38 trillion that year. Compare that to the US, gobbling up 14.8% of China's exports, over $500 billion. Hong Kong's at 8.1%, Japan's at 4.7%, even Vietnam's at 4.1%, with $138 billion. India's 3.5% lands it in 6th place, behind Vietnam of all places. And don't get too excited about that 1.4 billion population either. Reports, like one from the BBC, say over 1 billion Indians are barely scraping by, with no spare cash for anything beyond rice and rent. So, India's this huge market. Really? Tell that to China, who's shipping more to Vietnam than to you. India's not the golden goose they can't live without. It's more like a side gig they could ditch without a second thought. Now here's where it gets brutal. China can afford to lose India, but India's in no position to say the same. In fiscal year 24, that $118.4 billion trade with China broke down ugly. $101.7 billion was imports from China, and a laughable $16.67 billion was exports to them. That's an $85 billion trade deficit, and it's a gut punch. India's hooked on China for 44% of its telecom and smartphone parts, 77.7% of its laptops and PCs, and huge chunks of machinery and chemicals, according to GTRI data. Take smartphones. India's obsessed with brands like Xiaomi and Oppo, which rely on Chinese supply chains. If China pulled the plug, India's tech and manufacturing would be toast. But what does China get from India? Mostly raw stuff like iron ore and cotton, barely 0.8% of China's $2.55 trillion in total imports. In 2023, China imported $20.4 billion from India, pocket lint compared to their $271 billion from the US or $235 billion from Japan. If India stopped buying, China wouldn't even notice. They'd just sell elsewhere. India's the one sweating here, not China. That $85 billion gap isn't just a number, it's a neon sign screaming who's really dependent. Moving on, China's got way bigger fish to fry than India's market. Their Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI, ties them to 140-plus countries, with trade worth $19.47 trillion in 2023. That's 46.6% of their total trade per their own stats. India's not in that club and doesn't fit China's grand plan to dominate global trade routes. Look at their border spats like the 2020 Galwan clash where 20 Indian soldiers died and China didn't even blink at the trade fallout. Or take 2017's Doklam standoff, 73 days of tension, and China still didn't budge. Why? Because $118 billion isn't worth compromising their bigger goals for. They're flexing muscle across Asia. Think Pakistan's Gwadar port or Sri Lanka's Hambantota, both BRI projects. While India's just a pesky neighbour they'd rather shove than appease. China's building an empire, and India's market is a nice little bonus, not a deal-breaker. Finally, the numbers don't lie. India's leverage is a joke. China's GDP in 2022 was $18 trillion nominal. India's was $3.5 trillion. Fast forward to fiscal year 24, China's trade with India is 2% of its total, while India's trade with China is 15% of its own, $118 billion out of $776 billion per India's Commerce Ministry. That's a massive gap. China's economy is 5 times India's size, and their trade machine is so spread out, $1.6 trillion with ASEAN, $1.2 trillion with the EU, that India's this tiny speck. Meanwhile, India's leaning hard on China. 15% of its trade is no small potatoes. Indians might strut around boasting about their billion-plus people, but to China they're a small fry. The stats don't care about feelings, and they're screaming that China's got the upper hand. So here's the deal. India's not invincible just because it's got a billion-plus mouths to feed. China's trade machine is too massive, too diversified, and too strategic to lose sleep over India's market. India's hooked. $85 billion deficit, tech dependency, the works. But China's got options for days. They're not sweating India when they've got ASEAN, the US and the EU in their back pocket. Time to wake up and see who's really running this show. What do you think? Can India turn this around, or are they stuck in China's shadow? Drop your thoughts below and let's keep digging into the real stories on Info Safari. Smash that like button if you survived all these stats, and I'll see you in the next one.